Welcome. Today we're diving straight into a structured visual journey through one of the most defining and, honestly, most devastating chapters in U.S. history. In this historical explainer, we're going to map out a visual chronology of the American Civil War, taking you all the way from the very first shots fired in 1861 right down to the final surrender in 1865. You see, the United States was deeply, fundamentally fractured. Economic disagreements quickly boiled over into massive disputes over states' rights, and, at the very core of it all, the institution of slavery. This massive divide led the Southern states to actually secede and form the Confederate States of America. And what followed? A brutal four-year conflict, as the United States responded with military force to preserve the Union. By zooming in on the major turning points in key battles, we're going to see exactly how the tide of this massive war shifted.
All right, here's our game plan. First, 1861, spark of the conflict. Second, 1862, bloody standoff. Third, 1863, the great turning point. Fourth, 1864, total war. And finally, number 5, 1865, finale at Appomattox.
Section 1, 1861, spark of the conflict. Let's get into it.
So, this year kicks off with an intense secession crisis right after Abraham Lincoln is elected. South Carolina breaks away first, and 6 more states quickly follow suit, leading to the rapid creation of the Confederate States of America down in Montgomery, Alabama. Things were heating up insanely fast. In April 1861, Confederate forces under Pierre Beauregard actually fired the very first shots of the war, attacking Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. The Union surrenders the fort, and President Lincoln immediately calls up 75,000 volunteers. Now, if anyone thought this was going to be a quick little skirmish, July proved him completely wrong. At the First Battle of Bull Run, the Union Army goes on the offensive, but Confederate reinforcements completely turn the tables, sending Union forces into a chaotic retreat back to Washington. It became crystal clear right then and there this was going to be a long, drawn-out fight. So much so that by August, the U.S. Congress had to pass the first-ever national income tax, a 3% tax on incomes over $800, literally just to help foot the bill for the skyrocketing military costs.
The North's strategic response was pretty much immediate. To choke out the rebellion, the Union Navy rolled out the Anaconda Plan. And just like the snake, the goal was to completely squeeze the life out of the Southern economy and its supply lines by blockading Southern ports. Because the South relied so heavily on exporting goods, this blockade instantly forced the Confederacy into panic mode, desperately seeking foreign aid and recognition from global powers like Great Britain just to break that naval death grip.
Moving right along to Section 2, 1862, bloody standoff.
This year is defined by a wild geographic contrast. While the Union forces were making some really solid strategic gains in the Western theater, they were hitting a massive brick wall in the East. Out west, Union General Ulysses S. Grant was building serious momentum. In February, he captures Fort Donelson after a tense 4-day siege, and by April, he survives a massive Confederate surprise attack at the Battle of Shiloh, eventually forcing the enemy to retreat. But in the East, a totally different story. Confederate General Robert E. Lee takes command of the Army of Northern Virginia and goes on the offensive. Lee pushes Union forces away from Richmond during the 7 Days battles, and then he launches his first major invasion of the North, up into Maryland. And that brings us straight to the Battle of Antietam in September.
At Antietam, the human cost of this conflict hit a truly staggering milestone. Over 10,000 casualties. And that's on each side. Just let that number sink in for a second. It was an absolutely brutal, horrifying clash. Ultimately, Lee was forced to retreat. And while it wasn't the total destruction of the Confederate Army, Lee stepping back gave President Lincoln the exact political capital and military momentum he needed to drop a bombshell, the Emancipation Proclamation.
Which brings us to Section 3, 1863, the great turning point.
This is the absolute climax of the conflict. The year started with incredible historical weight. On January 1st, the Emancipation Proclamation officially took effect, declaring that enslaved people living in the rebelling states were now free. The war was officially a war for liberation. The year itself was an absolute roller coaster. In May, Robert E. Lee scored a massive tactical victory over the Union at Chancellorsville, but it came at a catastrophic internal cost for the Confederacy. Legendary Southern General Thomas Stonewall Jackson was accidentally shot by his own men during a nighttime reconnaissance mission and later died of pneumonia. Then, in July, the war basically exploded simultaneously on 2 totally different sides of the country. And later, in November, Lincoln would honor the fallen at a national cemetery with his iconic Gettysburg Address.
But let's pause here for a second. What exactly changed the course of the war in July 1863? How did the momentum permanently shift away from the Confederacy in just a matter of days?
It was essentially a double disaster for the South. Out in the West, after a grueling siege, the Union finally captured Vicksburg. This was huge because it meant the North gained total control of the Mississippi River, literally slicing the Confederacy in half. Simultaneously, over in the East, Robert E. Lee's second invasion of the North was violently stopped at Gettysburg over 3 incredibly bloody days. The Union held their ground, famously defending Little Round Top with a bayonet charge by the 20th Maine and completely crushing Pickett's charge, a moment we now know as the high watermark of the Confederacy. They were broken on 2 fronts at the exact same time.
And the attitude of the Union leadership? It was hardening, fast. At Vicksburg, when asked about terms, Ulysses S. Grant famously demanded immediate and unconditional surrender. He wasn't playing around. And that totally uncompromising stance resulted in the surrender of 29,000 Confederate troops at Vicksburg alone.
All right, Section 4, 1864, Total War.
Riding high on these victories, Lincoln brings Grant to the east and makes him the commander of all Union armies. Lincoln basically tells him, "I'm not going to interfere, I just want you to be decisive." And Grant changes the whole playbook to a strategy of relentless, non-stop pressure. You see this immediately in the brutal meat grinder of events that followed. In May, Grant and George Meade crossed the Rapidan River with 100,000 troops, kicking off the Overland Campaign aimed right at Lee's army in Richmond. Meanwhile, General William Tecumseh Sherman is leading 110,000 men toward Atlanta. In June, Grant orders a massive assault against fortified Confederate positions at the Battle of Cold Harbor, and by December, Sherman hasn't just captured Atlanta, he's completed his totally devastating march to the sea, arriving in Savannah.
But this strategy of relentless pressure, it came with horrifying human costs. 60,000. In less than 2 months of the Overland Campaign, Grant's forces suffered over 60,000 killed and wounded. In just one single day at Cold Harbor, 12,000 Union soldiers were lost. Grant himself later admitted that specific assault was a major mistake. Even so, because of how severely depleted the South's manpower was, the proportionally smaller losses suffered by the Confederacy were just mathematically impossible for them to replace.
While Grant was systematically grinding down Lee's army in the North, General Sherman was applying this brutal method of total war in the Deep South. Step 1. In September, he captured Atlanta, a totally vital railroad and industrial hub. Step 2. In November, he set off on his legendary march to the sea, intentionally carving out a massive path of destruction, obliterating Southern supply lines, and entirely crushing civilian morale. Step 3. In December, he captured Savannah, which essentially sliced the remaining Confederacy horizontally, isolating their armies even further.
Which brings us to our final chapter, Section 5, 1865, Finale at Appomattox.
By this point, the window for the South was slamming shut. The Confederacy was starving, geographically carved up, and staring down absolutely inevitable defeat. The collapse in 1865 happened with breathtaking speed. On April 2nd, Lee was forced to retreat from Petersburg, and the Confederate capital of Richmond finally fell to Union troops. With his army totally surrounded and out of options, Lee officially surrendered to Grant on April 9th at the McLean House in Appomattox. But the joy of that victory, it was unbelievably short-lived. Just 5 days later, on April 14th, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated.
But before we get to the aftermath of that tragedy, let's look at the actual surrender terms Grant offered Lee. Officers and cavalrymen were allowed to keep their horses and sidearms and simply return home. All other military equipment was surrendered. On top of that, Grant actually ordered that Union rations be given to the starving Confederate soldiers. So here's the crucial takeaway. Grant's generous terms were deeply intentional. They weren't designed to humiliate a beaten army. They were designed to treat the Confederates with dignity and respect, kickstarting the unbelievably difficult process of national healing.
Sadly, that healing process was violently cut short. While attending the play Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater, President Lincoln was shot by John Wilkes Booth, throwing the nation right back into total chaos. So think about this. With the country structurally and emotionally completely fractured and its visionary leader murdered just days after securing victory, how could the United States possibly rebuild? The staggering, monumental challenge of Reconstruction and integrating millions of newly freed slaves now suddenly fell onto the shoulders of President Andrew Johnson. And that is the profound question I want to leave you pondering today, because it set the entire stage for the next, highly complex era of American history. Thank you so much for joining me in this historical explainer, and remember to always keep asking questions of the past,